And you guys can feel free to jump in anytime if you want. But we're going to do...
Oh, that's good.
We'll try to do maybe 2 half-hour segments with a little break in the middle.
All right.
We can go to half an hour and see how you feel. And if we want to stop.
Well, I've been resting.
Okay.
Sorry.
So today, let's see, what's today?
26?
The 26th of July, 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And where are we?
We're in Rose Lane.
We're in Alden Road, Rose Lane.
Yeah, and we're here with a bunch of the family. We got Zach and Lori and the twins.
Open her out.
And Wendy. And Toshi.
He's doing the movie.
Just so we can all remember. So I want to do kind of a chronological story. I want to start off at the beginning. So if you could just start off by telling us, and try to include dates when you can.
Okay.
Or as much as you can remember. So if you could start off by just telling us when and where and how you became to be born.
I was born on Emancipation Day, August 26, 6 years after the women got the vote in the United States. That always affected me later. I thought there's a reason. And I happened to be born less than a mile from where I'm sitting, to a family named Rose. That's why I like being on Rose Lane, where a lot of roses are in bloom right now. And I was the 8th of a large family, and the house that I was born into was an old farmhouse. And my parents spent a lot of their time renovating it and making it livable for a big family. And it was very dominant in our lives where we lived, because the house had a character of its own. It had a big yard, and we had a chance to have a lot of fun in the yard. We had wonderful parents who let us make the yard into pretty much what we wanted it to be. We would have we'd swing from the trees. We had a lot of big trees, and we'd make little golf courses, and we would make, we'd take umbrellas and make parachute jumps, and in the winter we would make places to sled, and we had pretty much the run of the place.
Where was this farm?
It was right in Bernathen on Alden Road, and we're not exactly sure how old it was, but it was probably today it's almost 200 years old.
There was a whole estate, right?
Yeah, it was a, pardon?
There's a whole estate, many houses on the property.
Yeah, today it's got 6 different families living on it. But at that time, it was, our family had the main house. We sort of spilled out into other parts, like we would, my mother would have her baby in a little house they called the Come Again cabin in the back. And she'd go up there for when a baby was born, and so she was nearby, but she had her own little world, and we were always fixing it up. It was so old. We were always being challenged by this house, and we were always being challenged by the fact that there were so many of us. And in those days, of course, there weren't too many closets, so we had a problem of, you know, where'd we put everything, where'd we put everybody, and it was kind of hectic. But my father was a writer, and he turned this around into part of the way he earned a living. He wrote about this. He wrote about the fact that our house was not a typical suburban place, that there was always something unexpected happening. So he wrote a book called My Own Four Walls, which is about how he got it and what his dreams were for it, and we had the fun of watching him improve this property. He loved gardening, and he was always out there planting more flowers, and by the time I got engaged, the grounds were very, very beautiful. They had a wonderful garden party for me for announcing my engagement. And again, my wedding reception was on this property. By then, the children were old enough to all pitch in and make it really beautiful. And then we renovated one of the outbuildings into a apartment place, and that's where we started out our marriage, when I married Lawrence Soneson when I was 22. And so I only had to go half a mile to where I lived for the next 4 years, and where my daughter Wendy and my daughter Sonia were born. So this was a very, very important part of my life. I loved living on Alden Road, and I walked up the this road for 17 years without interruption, going to school. And now I'm living in that same environment and watching my grandchildren walk up that same road to go to that same school, which gives my life a nice sort of a closure. And as I sit here, I can look out the window and I can see the tops of the trees that are around the house where I was born. This was sort of one of my dreams, because I have moved around a lot. I lived in pretty many places, and sometimes I get very homesick for this area. So my life has a nice sort of a symmetry to it, that I came back here and now I can enjoy my memories. My big loss right now is that my husband has died, but I have such an extended family and such wonderful offspring and grandchildren that I'm not what you would call a person that's sort of living her last days alone. To the contrary, I see evidence of my husband's family all around me. And I look at my daughter and I can see in her face my husband's face, and I look at my other daughter's talents and I can see my husband's talents, so that's a big comfort.
Can you talk a little bit more about your childhood and what that was like for you, especially being in such a big
Well,
family?
I guess one of the very dominant things was that my father was from England, and he brought a lot of his family ideals with him. He had a very strong personality, and he was a very, very curious and intelligent person.
Did he have an English accent?
He overcame that because he became a public speaker. By the time he came here in 1908, so by the time I was born or old enough to notice such things, he had pretty much changed because he was a public speaker. And his sister came and lived next door to us, and she did have an English accent. And he went back there.
What was her name?
Olive.
Olive.
And he went back to England 9 times, I think, and would bring the culture back. But he loved this country, and he was one of those Horatio Alger stories where he came with almost nothing, and he was very, very successful in many ways. He became a very productive and inspirational person. And I had a wonderful mother who was born in this same area, and she was a very devoted mother. That was her great love in life, was to be with children. That's all she wanted, was a big family. 2 of the tragedies that had impacted my parents was that they were very affected by World War I because they were in England on a honeymoon when World War I broke out. And then they both lost brothers in that war. They were killed in action, and my mother lost 5 siblings before they were 2 years old.
From what?
Oh, in those days, babies died very easily. I'm not quite sure. Diphtheria and not malnutrition, but feeble, and they didn't know what to do for them. Different things like that. no accidents, but they just didn't survive. And it was country, so it might, and they kept animals, so it might have been from contaminated water or something. But as a result, she just treasured children. She thought she would lose half of us. So I think that's one reason they had a lot of children, because they'd had so many deaths in their life. And a lot of their relatives didn't have any children. So we became the children of this extended family. And we were always on display. People were always taking our pictures and always gaping at us and talking about us. And she was a wonderful professional seamstress, and she would dress us up and make us look really cute. And people were always saying, "There goes the roses." And we were very close in age. I think that there was only 15 years for 12 of us. So everybody liked to line us up and say, "Oh, isn't that something?" And I kind of got used to that. It was weird. And then my father, after he had taught for the first part of his marriage, but then he moved into writing and working in a newspaper and publicity. And so as part of his work, because he wrote about us all the time, he had a daily column, we became known in the immediate area, and they were always talking about how can we use these roses in a publicity stunt. There was a big magazine at that time called Look magazine, and it was a weekly, pretty well known, and they came out and took pictures of us and posed us, and we were on one of the first TV programs. We went up to New York and stayed at the Barbizon Plaza, and we were always doing these stunts, and then we'd go back to a very frugal life because it was the Depression. So it was sort of feast and famine. They would rent a bus, a private bus, for us to go to New York, so we were just like kings and queens. Then we'd come home and have oatmeal for supper. So, we got a chance to understand both worlds. And the Depression made a big impact on us, because there were a lot of us, and because of the age we were, and we became used to doing without.
How old were you when the Depression came?
Well, it began to impact this area at the beginning of the 30s, so I was just I was less than 5 years old. Oh, and another thing that impacted me very much was that I had 3 brothers and 1 sister younger than me before I was still 4.5 years old. So we were sort of like a little litter of puppies, and I was given a lot of responsibility for this little group of 4 children. So, I was always watching out for them. There were 7 boys and 5 girls, and in those days, they would divide the workload to domestic sort of things and outdoor sorts of things. So the brothers did things like chop wood and rake the lawn and so forth, and the girls did the domestic things. So I had a lot of responsibility from when I was very little, keeping an eye on these little children. I was the shortest one, so I was really little, trying to figure out how to handle these little kids. But I'm glad to tell you that they all turned out really well.
How did you and your siblings get along? Did everybody get along, or did some people not get along, or?
Well, I had a very kind mother who had a Quaker background. She put very, very high emphasis on not fighting, not, resolution of conflict, try to get along. Children don't fight, this was sort of her mantra.
Did it work?
So, well, we had no corporeal punishment. She had a very high tolerance for our antics. I mean, we were always racing around and yelling and everything, and I don't know how she tolerated it. But we had a tremendous amount of freedom. And we were allowed to yell and complain and not eat what we didn't feel like eating, and making demands on her. And she was just giver.
Tell about Jack and how he used to get all your quarters, and Frank when he didn't speak to you for a year.
Oh, because I was smoked.
Well, that was when you were older.
Wait, can you quickly just name all your brothers and sisters?
Well, there was Trin, the oldest. She went on to have a big family herself. You know quite a few of her offspring. We've lost her. She's been gone for about a year and a half. Big influence on me. She took care of me a lot. And the system was that the oldest took care of the youngest, like that. The second oldest took care of the second youngest. Worked out a system that way. And so we did a lot of the caring for each other, and my mother was kind of the supervisor to see that it worked. But we grew up recognizing that responsibility was important. And she had a very definite sense of values. So your question was?
Well, first can you just tell us all?
Oh, then there was Leon.
Yeah,
He was the oldest boy, and I saw him last night. He's now very up in years, but still has a sense of humor. He had a big impact on me because he lived in New York during the 40s, and I went up and helped with the family and got to know him and his first wife very well. Had a lot of good contacts with him, and later my grown family, my family of marriage, actually lived with Leon after his wife died. So I was very close to him. And then there was Roy. I didn't know him as well, but he was a very fun kind of a brother, had a good sense of humor, but pretty busy with his own life. And then Muriel, who was a peaceful, kind of accepting, good-natured, very much like my mother, kind person, and still is. She's sort of my model. She just takes what comes and puts a good interpretation on everything, and she's very creative and just has been an example to me of how a woman should be. And then there's Stanley, and Stanley was more volatile. He was more aggressive, I guess you'd say. So I had some conflicts with Stanley. Like he would chase me or argue with me. But then he had another side. So I would fight back. I was very feisty. And so Stanley and I would, and I guess Stanley and a few of the other members of the family would probably come as close to fighting as you could say. But it was more running around the dining room table than actually hitting. So hitting was considered a pretty low thing to do. I mean, it was pretty much frowned on, physical abuse of any kind. But we did a lot of yelling at each other. And so I got over those conflicts with Stanley later, and he became interested in magic, and he would entertain us a lot, and he was very handsome and very dapper and very affectionate. And we buried our hatchets, so that was good. And then there was Sylvia, who was very different from me, but very much into keeping an eye on me and making sure I walked the narrow path. She would leave notes all the time for me to guide me through my crushes with boys, like one that I found on my mirror when I came home one night after I'd been out on a date with somebody and given. She didn't think that I treated this boy the way I should have. So I find this note on the mirror saying, people who step on hearts are walking on dangerous ground. She always advising me and very honest, but very correct in her. I mean, she had a very good sense of principles. So my mother didn't do very much of that. Sylvia was the one who said, "That's not done. We don't do that. Don't wear that. You don't look right." So she took this little mother role, and she's still doing that. But I resent it sometimes, but I respect her because I know she means well. She's just trying to make me my life work. For example, she's the one that really helped me stop smoking. And I appreciate that. Are you all right, Laurie?
She always takes little naps.
Pardon?
Sorry, if I nurse in the afternoon in the soft chair.
Oh, okay.
Got her.
You tell me if something comes up that we should be changing. And then there was Jack. I just loved Jack, and Jack was kind of instrumental in the man I married because they were very close friends. They were in the same class at school, and they started setting things up where I could be involved. They had a quartet, and they would come and practice singing. Barbershop quartet. And my husband Larry would come to the house to practice, and they had one song they sang, which he had a beautiful singing voice, my husband did. And
Which range?
he was bass. And they had one song they sang, which was My Little Margie, my name was Marjorie. And I would just sit in my room and listen to them practice and think, yeah, I know he's really singing that to me. And it was wonderful. It was fun. He was in and out a lot, and he had come from a family where most of the people in the family were all grown up, so he was very drawn to our very child-oriented household. He loved coming there because he could just relax and joke around and be silly. So he said he fell in love with the family, and then later he fell in love with me. He actually dated my sister as well as me at first, Sylvia. And so Jack was very smart with money, and he was always teaching us how to handle money, like we'd play Monopoly, and he would always win. And people would come in and give everybody in the family a nickel or something like that, just to entertain us. And Jack would figure out ways to get the nickels, and by the end of the day, he'd have all the nickels. So we sort of looked to him as somebody who knew how to stay solvent, and he became a CPA. He sort of advised the family financially from then on.
How did he? Can you give me an example of how he would get a nickel? Get someone's nickel?
Oh, grown-ups would come in and say, "Oh, how cute you are," and then give us all a nickel.
No, but how would Jack get your nickels?
Oh, he would say, if I go and get you a glass of milk, will you give me a nickel?
So was it fair exchanges, or was he?
Well, I mean, he'd invent these little things. And we were so naive, somehow we weren't quite sure how he managed to do this. And he also sort of took charge of other things, like he taught us all how to drive a car, and how he was very sensible, very good advisor. And I could go and talk to him and get advice from him. And then he started counseling me on my boyfriends, and he sort of looked at, I liked the way that everybody sort of looked out for each other. They all wanted each other's lives to work. And so they found their different ways of doing that. And then then I came, and then after me was Frank, who I saw last night. He's another person who was very special to me. We were very close in age. Within a year, we were almost like twins. And actually had a wedding ceremony at one time when we got married. The whole family decided to have a wedding, and we have wonderful pictures of these events. My father was a photographer.
Wait, you and Frank got married?
Yeah, I was the bride.
How old were you?
I was 5 and he was 4. And another member of the family was we got really dressed up in beautiful outfits. And somebody else was the maid of honor. It was sort of like that cartoon. Our Gang, yeah. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then my father would take movies of this. And
movies? Is there movies still?
He did have a movie camera. He earned.
His movies?
No, they were made from. They were made on this flammable nitrate, and they were considered too dangerous to keep. But we would show them to the family later, over and over again. We would see these movies of ourselves, and so we sort of spent a lot of time amusing each other in that way. We paid a lot of attention to each other and what we were doing. Sort of egocentric.
What were some other examples of of Rose family projects?
Well, one of them was a circus that they put on, which was just wonderful. I had long sausage curls. I came down to almost to my waist. So they made me the bearded lady. And,
What year is this? Or how old are you?
I was probably about 8 when we did that. And we just turned the whole backyard into this huge circus. And the older boys did these wild tricks. Everybody had costumes, and we would charge admission. People would come from all around to see this circus. It would take up just about the whole summer making the equipment. We'd build our own props, things people would jump through, and we would dress up the dog to be a tiger or whatever. It was very, very corny, but fun. We didn't care if people thought it was corny. They all came and thought it was hilarious. And this was the Depression, so this is how we amused each other, with practically no money exchanged. We just make things out of old bottle caps and I don't know what, old bottles, and we would toss a coin into the bottle and jump off the roof, and the freak
Jump off
and
the roof.
yeah, pay 10 cents and jump off the roof with this parachute, which was an umbrella. It was, and of course kids got hurt and everything, but we
People broke their arms and legs a lot at that house.
There's no liability
Yeah, we had-
issues back then.
that's right, it was so different.
What about the helicopter?
Oh, that was later, but it was a big project. My father wrote a book called Full House, which had a chapter for each member of the family, and that was more or less directed at describing who these different children were. Oh, I didn't tell you that there was Kenneth, who came next. He was very precocious. He was 3 when I was 5. And I remember saying to my mother, how do you spell some word? And she said, oh, ask Kenneth. And Kenneth was 3. And that hit me that I better get my act together. I was learning how to spell for my little brother. And I sort of said, I don't know.
He had little golden curls, right?
Yes, he was very cute and very into his own head. I've often thought that Schroeder in Peanuts was like him. You know, the one that plays the piano. He wouldn't talk very much. He would just sort of start, what are you thinking about, Kenneth? And he'd say, oh, the moon, or something like that. So we just sort of worked around him. He had deep thoughts and very good in math. He ended up being a math teacher. Very interesting person. And then after him was Donette, who was sort of, she's the only one I remember having health problems. Before she was a year old, she had all these contagious diseases. In those days, people actually had whooping cough and measles, and you had to quarantine the house. And one of the local jokes was that when we quarantined our house, because everybody was getting the mumps, the neighborhood kids would stand outside asking, is your quarantine almost over? Because they were allowed to come to our house and do all these wild things that they weren't allowed to do at their own house. And we didn't really mind being quarantined too much because we could play with each other. And it took a long time to get through. I remember one time I woke up and I felt just awful. Couldn't swallow, couldn't imagine what was wrong with me. So I called my mother, and she came and she just looked at me and she said, oh no, not mumps, and went out of the room and didn't say anything to me. Thought, what have I done? And of course I had started the mumps through the whole family. So that was understandable that she was a little dismayed. Anyhow, Donette got 3 of these contagious diseases before she was a year old.
Oh, really?
So she was very little and had to be carried a lot. And she is, you can't tell it now. She recovered from this. But we always thought of her as very fragile. And she was like a little toy, sort of. And then Donald was the baby, and we called him Baby till he was 5 years old, which was probably traumatic for him. But he was a little golden-haired boy with a wonderful disposition. We had things like croquet sets and things that require a fairly large group of children to play. We could really have fun with those things. And we would get all dressed up for things like the 4th of July parade, and we'd go swimming every day at a local pond, and we had a kind of easygoing life without too many worries. We were pretty oblivious of the world. And in those days, people, when I was very young, people came to the house with their grocery carts, and there were butcher wagons and ice wagons and milk wagons and everything, brought the food to the house. And so we would all run out and watch them cut the meat on these trucks, and then my mother would come out and order the meat, and it was very interesting.
What were the meals like?
Meals?
Yeah, what would you eat?
What would be considered very healthy food today.
For instance, can you give an example of like a typical meal?
Good, basic rice, but tastes very much like you eat. And
Fresh vegetables.
yeah. Luckily, they had this vegetable man that came and brought vegetables around. We had our own vegetable garden. We had a beautiful flower garden.
What was your favorite food when you were little? Remember?
I liked everything. I liked all the food. And I had a lot of responsibility with setting and clearing the table. And I didn't, I remember setting the table when I was so little. I had to reach up like this, put a fork, a spoon, knife, plate. So I must have been pretty short. And I liked to clear because I could eat what people didn't eat, the leftovers.
You're still doing it.
I'm still doing it, right.
So you're saying you just, as kids, you were pretty unaware of the impacts of the Depression?
Well, you've heard the cliche many times, but it's true. Everybody was in the same situation. It was not unusual to have somebody in the family who didn't have shoes to wear, for example.
How many dresses did you have and how many toys?
Well, I was fortunate in clothing because my mother loved to make clothes, and she made me beautiful little dresses to wear. But we took really good care of these things. And in those days, they didn't have play clothes. They had old clothes, which today would be thrown away, and your good clothes. And you would have a certain dress that you wore to church, and you didn't touch that for the rest of the week. And she worked very, very hard to get us all dressed up for church. That would start on Saturday, and she'd get everything all lined up. It was sort of like a fashion show. And then the minute we got home, we had to take all those clothes off and put them back in a very careful way so that they'd be ready for the next church, because laundry in those days was a real nightmare. And then we'd put on some simple old sort of a shift type thing. And the same thing for school. The minute you came home from school, you would change your clothes because you had to keep those things nice for school. So there's a big difference, and then a big difference between when you went out and when you were at home. And at home, when you were at home, you just wore sort of nondescript, simple clothes, just to keep warm. There's no fashion involved. And because she was a seamstress, that meant that we were able to be pretty well dressed. So that we were lucky.
Your mother sewed all your clothes?
Pardon?
Did your mother sew all your clothes?
Yeah, she made me beautiful clothes. I can still remember what some of them looked like.
What were some of your favorites?
She tried to dress Sylvia, me, and Donette the same. We all wore the same outfits. And then one day Sylvia said, oh, that was too babyish, so she wouldn't wear. So that kept up with me and Donette for quite a while. And they were very frilly, feminine, with big sashes and big puff sleeves. And girls didn't wear slacks in those days. Little jumpers and embroidered and everything. So I like that. But things like shoes were a problem because they cost a lot of money compared to what we had.
You had one pair of shoes or two?
You had one pair for church and one pair for every day, and everybody accepted hand-me-downs all the time. People passed clothes around to each other. I mean, if you had good clothes that your family had outgrown, you'd take them to the neighbor. That's how people kept going. And people weren't too embarrassed by that. So it was survival mode. And the same with food. There was a lot of sharing that went on. But one of the twists, the weird twists that I can remember vividly was what were called tramps or hobos. And we had a lot of them in Bernathen because they used the railroad tracks for their mode of, that's where they would walk, because they would get picked up and discouraged if they went on roads, so they'd go on the railroad tracks. So they'd just come into Bernathen on the railroad tracks, and they would wear these coats, and inside the coats were all the kinds of things that you would find in a dollar store today. And they'd come knock on the door, and then they would open up their coat, and there would be scissors and thread and needles, notions, and odds and ends like that. So I can remember sitting on our porch and watching this man open up his coat, and my mother would buy little things for around the house. So impressed by that. But there were so many of them during the worst of the Depression that it got to be a problem. And so she would train us to say, "My mother's asleep," or something like that. She wouldn't come to the door because there's just a limit to how much you could help these people. But that was very vivid.
Did you feed them food then, or did you also give them something to eat or not?
Yeah, sometimes you'd feed them. And people just did what... Well, I would say that we were pretty protected from the worst part. We weren't in a city. So we didn't see people actually... you know... what would be the word? Destitute. But we were very aware of the limitations of what we could expect. So for Christmas, for example, we would get clothes and maybe one toy.
What kind of toys? Like, what would be an example of toys?
Well, we made a lot of our own toys.
So like what?
Homemade toys. Like little bats, and we'd buy a ball and hit the bat with a ball, or little games where you would roll marble chutes. And is this the time to stop?
Yeah, let's pause for a second.
If you pointed your finger like this and made it into a gun, you were reprimanded. I mean, the idea of hurting somebody else was considered just beneath contempt. And you just sort of pick this up. So one time when I was just going into high school, I was invited to stay at the dormitory overnight, which was pretty exciting. And so I and a friend, another Bernathen friend, went up there and we got our stuff all settled, and then we're sitting there and we said, why don't we sneak out the window and go down to the valley and get some ice cream and bring it back. And that seemed pretty harmless to me. And so off we went, and we came back. And the person that was living in the dorm, that we were staying in her room, had a hearing problem. And so we had her tie a string to her toe and hang the string out the window, and we would pull on that when we wanted to climb back in. So we come in and we give them the ice cream and everything, and the next morning we were called to the dorm mother's office. And she said, did you sneak out last night and go? And we said, no. And she had the Dixie cup containers, and she said, it's not that you snuck out and got ice cream, it's that you lied about it. So we were banned. I've always thought about this when they were talking about whether or not to impeach a president. It was that you lied.
So can can you just go back a little bit and finish the end? I admit the tape actually ended right when you told the punchline of going home after getting in trouble.
Oh, okay.
Can you tell that part again, and then you
Yeah.
can tell.
Well, what I was saying was that the Ten Commandments were the house rules, and we knew about it if we were caught lying or stealing or something like that. And in the neighborhood, it was largely a residential area, but we did have this one little convenience store, and it was a big event to go up there. You'd save your little pennies or something like that, and that was a big adventure to be allowed to walk up there and go up and buy an ice cream cone or something. I think they cost a nickel or something in those days, and the person that ran it was in a house, and the person that ran it was a sweet old lady named Mrs. Heath. It was called Heath's Store, and she'd had quite a life herself in the theater. A remarkable woman, but she became widowed very young, and that's how she earned a living. So they had little notions there and treats and so forth, and we loved to go to this Heath Store. And I remember one time I went up there and I didn't have enough money to get what I wanted. In those days we wore these, my mother would make me these matching what they called bloomers, which were the same material as my dress. And they had elastic, and I remember I took a little pack of gum and I put it in my bloomer because I didn't have money. And Mrs. Heath said, "Now, Midget, I'm going to take the gum back, but I want you to go home and tell your mother what you did." So they all worked together, and she said, she didn't scream or yell, she just said, "You know you're not supposed to." And to this day I can still feel the air of shame that I broke the rule that you did not steal. And so they would just stop something like that and make a thing of it. And I thought it was very powerful.
Can you repeat again the comment, or talk again about the comment about how it was not okay, the values, that it was okay to...
Oh, it was okay, yeah. The house rules were the Ten Commandments. And some of them were inclusive of thou shalt not hit. I mean, they would say, well, that goes under this commandment. So hurting another person was considered, I guess, one of the two great commandments. Treat people like you would like to be treated yourself. But if you weren't breaking one of the commandments, like if you wanted to read a book after you probably should go to bed, you were allowed to do that because you weren't breaking a commandment. And so there was a lot of freedom up to a point, and then sort of an unyielding code of what you did and didn't do. And they used, this is a Quaker thing, I think. They used shame to control people. And we didn't go that far, but that was sort of the idea. And at the table you would hear about it. Oh, and I guess one of my low points was when I got hold of a cigarette. Not only I was in, I guess I was about 10, maybe a little older. And we had what we called assembly. And they were showing a movie. And the whole school was in there, and I'm sitting there with this cigarette, smoking. In the assembly. Just how dumb I was. I was kind of a giddy kid. And this smoke is going up like that. All of a sudden, the projector person clicks the thing. There is smoke in this room. Well, what was so terrible about it was that all my siblings were right in the room too. Frank was in the row right in front of me. Jack was in the row right. So at the table, at the table, they just looked at me. They said, "How do you think we felt when we look around this room full of children and it's our sister who is smoking this cigarette?" So Frank just gave me the silent treatment, which I think is also Quaker. And he just took a long time to forgive me for bringing disgrace on our family.
Hold on, I think you're being called. It's just one unusual thing.
Pardon?
Did you smoke normally when you were 10?
No. It was just I was sort of a giddy, it was a witless thing to do. I think somebody dared me or something. I mean, it was so inane. I mean, it wasn't as if I wasn't going to be caught. But I think somebody probably dared me or something and handed me the cigarette. Why don't you, Midgie, see, I was young and little. And why don't you, so I was sometimes the patsy. Well, we'll get Midgie to do this because she'll do anything. You know? And so I wasn't particularly enjoying it. I just sort of wondering, well, what is significant? So why is this significant? And was sort of surprised at the consequences. It certainly got a reaction. Oh, there she goes. She's the one that smoked that cigarette in chorus. Oh! So there was this feeling that the community had a code, and you wanted to be really careful not to break that code. And you weren't always exactly sure what the code was, but there's certain things we do, and there's certain things we will not do in this town. And we want to keep up our community reputation. And one of the downsides of this was that we had this idea of discrimination, but we called it distinctiveness. And actually it was quite prejudicial. So right up here at the top of Rose Lane was a field. And it connected us to the community over the hill. And they would play ball there. And we were allowed to go and watch, but we weren't allowed to play ball with them. And
You weren't allowed to play ball with kids from
other communities. If they weren't baptized in the church, we were discouraged from playing with them, and I always thought that was so peculiar. They looked like okay kids to me. And when we went, there was one food store down in the valley, and we were allowed to go down in the car with our mother when she went to get some groceries, and we were told, don't get out of the car because you might talk to one of those children from the valley. Mm-hmm. And this gave us such a peculiar message. We never could quite figure it out. What was their crime, you know? Mm-hmm. They just looked like ordinary kids to me. And I think they regretted that later. But you ask anybody in my age group, they'll remember that you did not mix with children that were not going to your school. So they kept calling it distinctiveness, and the adults would talk about, oh, well, that's not discrimination, you know. We're just being distinctive. And it was phony. And I don't think they do that as much anymore.
What about racial issues at that time? You mentioned that you had a black maid come in. What were the kind of perceptions about differences between race and things? Your family?
Well, these were supposedly intelligent people, but they certainly didn't get that. One of the things that I used to wonder about is that these workers who helped to build the cathedral would come out on the train. Bernathen had its own little post office and its own little train station. And this train was very important because it connected us with the world. And a lot of people commuted on that train. Well, at 8 o'clock in the morning, these workers would come and walk up Almack Road up to the cathedral and work all day and walk down, get on the train and leave. And we weren't supposed to talk to them.
These were immigrant workers?
Well, they were skilled, but we were just, you know, you didn't talk to the people that worked on the bit. You know, they were strangers. So it was just sort of an unwritten rule. Oh, there they go. And they were building our cathedral. But we thought that was normal.
What about interactions with black people, though?
Almost everybody had black help. And they weren't treated as slaves, but they weren't treated as equals. We had a lot of affection for them. We had one called Lewis, who worked at the school in the dining hall. And they had his portrait painted, and they had him. I mean, we wrote songs for him because he was a great cook, and we all loved him. But you wouldn't see him at church. Once in a while, you would see black people attend a wedding or something, but they were sort of expected to sit in the back. And I always wondered about that. I kept thinking, what is it that is different about the black people? We were really very fond of our maid. Almost everybody could afford maids because I paid them hardly anything. But they became almost part of the family. If you found a maid that worked well with your family, you were considered very, very lucky. But we didn't extend any privileges to them. I mean, we didn't really treat them like equals.
You didn't call them Mr. or Mrs.?
No, called them Luella. I was a child, and her name was Mrs. Perry, but I called her Luella.
And what did she call you?
Well, she called my mother Mrs. Rose, but she would never, my mother would call her Luella. So it was very subtle. And I remember one time my mother used the word nigger, and I almost fainted.
What's nigger mean?
It's a nasty way of talking about black people. Because my mother would never use bad language, but that was acceptable. And so one of the things that stunned me when I became aware myself of this prejudice that was there was that they would put on minstrel shows. And these were
Who would?
the community. And they would put on this blackface and tell all these jokes about the blacks and imitate their accent and so forth. And our minstrel shows were very, very popular. But they were demeaning to the black race.
Did you think that at the time, or did you realize that later?
Well, what do you know? To show you how prejudice can be so sinister, when Sonia was born, we got this idea, she was born at the 4th of July, we got this idea of dressing my daughter Wendy up as a pickaninny, we called them. A pickaninny was a little black child. And we'd make up these funny stories about how cute little pickaninnies were. And so she and her cousin were dressed up. We blacked her face and got a wagon and put a big watermelon in it, and she got first prize. I mean, everybody thought that was okay. And yet there were black people who were working all through the community that must have been very hurt by that. But it just shows how sinister the whole thing is. If you can't see your own prejudice, how do you get rid of it? So later, when I was teaching kindergarten in the community, I was trying to tell them about Abraham Lincoln. And I said, children, I'm going to give you each a penny. That's Abraham Lincoln. And I guess you're wondering why he gets to be on our money and why we name things Lincoln and everything. But he was good to the blacks, and he didn't believe in slavery. And so I told them a little bit about what slavery was. And one of the Pitcairn children was in the class. And I said, look around the room. Do you see any black children in this room? They're not allowed in here. And I said, Lincoln wouldn't like that. He would like children to all go to school together. Well, this one little Pitcairn grandchild became very uncomfortable. And he asked if he could go home. The next day he didn't come to school. And I didn't make the connection, but the third day he came back, he came running in and he said, Mrs. Soneson, we pay our slaves. They had all this black help. It was Laird. We pay our slaves. So we're not bad. But his best friend was black. He was the sort of the young member of the family. Everybody else was pretty much older. And they had this man who did all kinds of work around the house. He spent more time with Laird than anybody else. And Laird didn't care that he was black. So this was just so shocking to him. And he would drive him to school. So he was different. And I think this was difficult for him. But
I'm sorry, when I went to change the tape, you were just about to talk about Pop Pop and the kind of man he was. You said he was a very tall man. And
very imposing, very sort of authoritarian.
How did he behave with you?
I mean, we were told to just not speak back to him. We were fed before he came home. When he walked in, his word was the law. But he didn't do it in any violent way. He just exuded this. You do not cross his path. And he worked very hard, and when his earlier children were born, he was a very hands-on father. But that changed as he became more and more overwhelmed with the amount of work he was doing. His sort of role changed, and so I personally didn't sit on his lap or talk to him very much. He would talk to us as a group, and he would come in, and working on a newspaper, he would bring home the newspaper, and he would just hand them, just, Daddy's home, and then we'd all lie on the floor and read the newspaper, the funnies and so forth. And he was a wonderful provider, but you couldn't tell him your troubles, because you always felt that he had weighty things on his mind. You know, he had so many things to think about. We couldn't dare tell him that we had this little problem. So we told our problems to each other. And we were expected to be silent when he said silence, and to obey his every command, yeah. But he wasn't, he didn't give a lot of commands, but we sort of wanted to please him. I guess that's what it was. We just didn't want to cross his path. And I always felt that he could have been a little bit more aware of. We thought that he didn't even notice us. But then he would write down these columns where he'd tell in great detail exactly what we did. So it was confusing, because it was obvious that he was paying a lot of attention to us, but I guess it was difficult for him to express it. I guess it might have been his English characteristic. So then when he didn't say very much, but when he said something, we all just stopped in our tracks and listened. Because he would say, well, I think the oracle is about to speak. And so he would make this big impression. And one of the things I just found out recently is that he got this idea from watching the cathedral being built to build. He would go up and observe how they built the walls and paths and everything. And he incorporated that in the development of his own property. And this became his major hobby, of making walls and paths and gardens and everything from the skills that he picked up. So he was not one of the people who did not speak to these workmen. He was from a different culture, and he didn't adopt the culture of the community. He pretty much stayed the way he was, and he was a very democratic person. He loved this country and became a citizen. And later he was invited to speak at immigration's naturalization services. He would often be invited to come and speak and tell them, this is a great country. He wrote about that a lot, that he started out with very little as a student, and every door was open to him. And coming from England, that was a big thing. His parents very much wanted him to come back to England, but he fell in love with this country. So he tried to get his parents to move to this country, but they couldn't make the change. They came and stayed for a couple of years, but they were just too English.
Did you meet his parents ever?
No, that was before I was born.
You never met his grandparents? I mean, your grandparents?
No, I wrote letters to them. They lived past the time that I was born. But
you do remember your grandfather Wells.
Yeah, he's the only one that lived
brother.
into my awareness. And he was quite a character. I spent a lot of time trying to find out more about him. I guess he was quite a character in this community. He was always the one that led the 4th of July parade because he had horses. And he was made a Kentucky colonel because he was a CPA and he saved the state of Kentucky in some lawsuit or something. So to honor him, they called him a Kentucky colonel from then on. And he raced in Surreys, I guess they're called. They're pulled by horses. He's kind of flamboyant, I guess.
Where did he grow up, or where he was he from England as well? Or?
No, his family was here from the Pilgrims.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the New England area. I've often wondered, his name was Wells, and I've often wondered if Wells up in Maine had any connection.
What was his first name?
John.
John Wells. And his wife's name was?
John Wells. John Augustus.
His wife's name?
Oh, Pauline. She was one of the Starkeys, which were a very important family in the community. They sort of dominated it. There
Which
were
community? In
Bernathen. Yeah. They were in Philadelphia, this Starkey family. And then when they decided to make this into a little community for a school, they all moved out here. So my mother moved into I think it was the 4th house that was built in the area. And they were very much subsidized by John Pitcairn. And John Pitcairn was my mother's uncle. So she was given a lot of perks. I don't know if he helped pay for them to get this house, but the Starkeys sort of ran the show. They were sort of the dominant family, and because of their Pitcairn connection, I guess.
And was your father in the church before you met his mother?
He was in what's called the conference, and his family went back 10 generations, back to the very beginning.
Also Swedenborgian Church?
Yeah. Yeah, he and the Starkeys, I think, came in fairly early on. But they, as I say, they were Quakers. They were New England people too. And I understand that my grandmother, Pauline Wells, was a very remarkable woman. The people that I've talked to her that knew her said that she was very smart, very aware of a woman's importance. She had a lot of self-respect. And when she lost her son in World War I, she was interviewed, and you could tell she was a very articulate person, but she had rather fragile health. But then during the Depression, she was always helping people. And she had students come and stay there. And she was always looking out for other people and always getting into discussions and having an influence on the people that knew her. And I was 1 year old when she died, so I have pictures of myself with her, but I don't remember her. She named me, I know that. She picked out my name. But my mother would say over and over again, I had the most wonderful mother. And she couldn't say enough for what a great mother she had. So she said that was one of her great gifts in life, that she had a good mother. So I've always wanted to be buried right near her up at the graveyard in Bernathen. Has its own little graveyard, and I took Wendy up there and I said, why don't you bury me up there, this little group of my great-grandmothers and grandmothers, because I just feel very linked to her emotionally, even though I didn't have a lot of actual time with her, but I heard a lot of talk about her. And then I had a couple of doting aunts who were important in our life. They helped raise us. Hi, Ben. Aunt Valida and Aunt Carol. And they were pretty independent for their age that they were living in. They both made careers. My Aunt Carol had the equivalent of a doctor in what we'd call alternative medicine at this time. She was doing things like massage therapy and light therapy and aromatherapy. And
what years? What time period?
Well, she was probably born in 1900. And she would go doggedly back and get this training. And everybody thought she was so eccentric, but she was just so far ahead of her time. And you know, she just didn't care. She was very independent. She rode horses and just a remarkable woman. You've never met Aunt Carol because she's so important to me.
Oh, I remember Aunt Carol.
Actually, I think Toshi was with her when she died.
Was that Aunt Carol?
Remember I took you to see Aunt Carol?
How old was I?
You were probably Micah's age.
What year?
I don't know, but I think I was taking care of you. And she was probably 90 by then. And she was very peaceful. She was at home at my brother's house. And I said, Toshi, do you want to go and say goodbye to your great aunt? And she came in and said, ooh. I think it was you. I know it was some child I took in.
That's right.
I think it was Toshi.
It's possible.
Yeah.
So, okay.
At what age did you learn to drive?
To drive?
Yeah.
About 20, because of the war. There was no gas, there were no tires. There was no way you could learn to drive during World War II because you couldn't get the practice in. So my brother taught me the mechanics of it. And I can remember one of the recurring dreams that I had was that I was in the driver's seat of a car and I didn't know how to drive. So it worried me a lot.
Tell about the car with no door.
Oh, okay. And my brother was actually into driver's ed, and he helped me learn to drive. But I was pretty old before compared to what they do nowadays. But I had a lot of company. That was because of the war.
But your father never learned to drive.
Oh, my father refused to learn to drive. When he was a little eccentric, he was kind of eccentric. I guess it would be safe to say that I had a lot of eccentricity in the family. People were kind of independent in their thinking, and they weren't afraid to be considered kind of peculiar. I always took a certain amount of encouragement from that. That they were nonconformist and kept track of what was going on in the world and had opinions. It was a sort of an idea family. They talked about ideas a lot. And I thought that was a great heritage. But the car door, this is written up in his books, but it's a true story. I can remember it vividly. We used to name our cars. We had one that was called the Green Monster, and it was kind of had round contours, and it was bright green. It's really, we loved that car. And we were down at the store getting groceries, and one of us had left the car door open. There was a telegraph pole, and somehow, when my mother started up the car, the door swung open and got knocked off of its hinges. And nobody knew how to fix it. It was a sort of depression time, and it was very hard to replace parts and things like that. So for quite a long time, I don't know how long it was, we would drive around in this car with no door. And every kid in the neighborhood wanted to do it. They thought we were so lucky that we had this car with no door. And we had ropes inside that we would hold on to so that we wouldn't fall out. And then as I got a little older, I thought, oh, this is kind of embarrassing that we don't have any door on our car. But then I'd swing back to thinking, this is kind of fun to have a car with no door. So my father got a lot of mileage out of that. But then I can remember when World War II came along, and everybody just put their cars in their garage. There wasn't much you could do because you were put in on a coupon basis of how much. World War II impacted our family very heavily. I had 5 brothers in the service. And then my father went into uniform and became a war correspondent. So I wrote to 25 servicemen. And it just took over our lives, the World War II. And when they were Micah's age, they'd go off to war. I just look back on that and I just think, that was terrible. These young kids, they couldn't finish high school.
Do you remember when you first heard about the war?
Yes.
What was that like? Can you tell the story of hearing about the war? What that was?
Well, it was Sunday again. It's Pearl Harbor. And again, we all went to church. We all went. It was held at 9:30, and we'd all been to church. And we used to come home. We'd have to change our clothes and hang up our Sunday clothes, and then we were allowed to read the Sunday funnies. So that's what I was doing. I was up in my room reading the Sunday funnies, and all of a sudden, my brother Jack called up the stairs. "We're in a war!" And we all just jumped out of our skins. Couldn't believe what we were hearing. We said, "What did you say, Jack?" He said, "We're in the war." And because my father was in the newspaper business, this was something that we talked about a lot. He'd bring home news flashes, and his family was still in England, so he was very concerned, very worried about it.
What did you think? How old are you at Pearl Harbor?
41. I was 14.
What did you think when you heard about this?
We were pretty frightened. And I remember going to adults and saying, "Tell me about World War I," and they wouldn't talk about it. "What was it like to be in a war? What's that mean?" And they'd say, "Oh, it wasn't nice." But it was so recent for them. It's only 20 years or something between those two wars. And there was so much pain in their lives still that they were just incredulous. You know, World War I was called the war to end wars. And they thought it would be the last war. So they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that we were in war again. And then they started drafting the young people. They had, when my class graduated from high school, almost every boy in the class was gone. They would have a little ceremony after chapel on Friday, giving them a token graduation diploma that they could redeem after the war. So everybody was very patriotic, but we just could not believe this had happened. One thing I do remember is in about 1937, we were shown a movie at school about this powerful new force that science had discovered. And they were saying, this force is so powerful that we aren't going to have to depend on gas anymore, and it's got enough energy so that we can have power for all the trains and cars and everything in the whole world. And it was talking on and on about energy, and it was talking about the atomic bomb, or the discovering of splitting the atom. And then they made that secret. And so there was suddenly, you heard nothing about it. So I'd say to grown-ups, "What was that movie they showed us?" Movie? It became top secret. So in August of 1945, I was working in a defense plant. And we were driving to work. We had a carpool. This man would come to Bernathen and pick up 3 or 4 of us, drive us over to Glenside where there was a defense plant, and I would run a lathe and make parts for an airplane. And we always had the radio on because we always wanted to know how the war was going. And the speaker on the radio started to talk about this amazing force that was so powerful and had been made into a bomb, and they dropped it. And we were just getting that news, and I immediately made the connection with that movie. They kept that a secret for, what, 7 years or something? I knew right away that's what they were talking about. And so I turned to one of the other people in the car and I said, "This is going to end war as we know it." That's what we talked about. This is so powerful that war will be unspeakable. It would be unimaginable. And so we sort of cheered. We said, "Hooray, this the end to war as we know it. People will start negotiating for peace instead of trying to find violent solutions. And so we went to the war plant and we did our work as usual, and then they called on the loudspeaker. They have dropped a second bomb or something like that. The war is over. So this defense plant just went bananas. So we jumped, they played the Star Spangled Banner, and we just all stood there crying and yelling, and we just couldn't go home. So we jumped in the car that we commuted in, and we went over to Jenkintown, which was the nearest thing we had to a city. So there's an intersection there called York and West, which I guess is as close as they had to downtown. And we just got squished in there, and there were thousands of people all converged in Jenkintown, and yelped and jumped up and down and said the war is over. And then they drove us home, and everybody was crying and celebrating. We didn't know quite what it meant, but then I went back to work the next day, and they said, "Oh, you're fired." We said, "Good." So we went down to the seashore, recovered. But I had been working 10 hours a night, 7 nights a week.
70 hours a week.
And I got covered with oil. I had to throw my clothes away.
How much did you get paid?
A lot for those times. That's how I paid. I don't know the exact amount, but it was an incredible amount of money for me. And that's how I paid for my college. Let's put it in the bank.
How did you feel initially when the idea of going to work, when you thought, I mean, were you obligated to go to work, or did you choose to go to work?
Well, the summer before that, I went to what was called the farmerettes. There was nobody to bring in the crops. And so some of us got this idea that we wanted to do something for the war effort. I was Micah's age. And of course, girls weren't drafted. So my father had some information. He went into Philadelphia every day, so he heard what was going on. He found out about these farmerettes who were helping to bring in the crops in New Jersey. There's just nobody to pick the vegetables and stuff. So they got college girls. So my best friend Carol and I volunteered, and it was a big adventure for us. We went down I was still in high school. I just finished high school. And then they opened up the colleges down there, the college campuses, and put us in there to live, which was a lot of fun. But then during the day, we had to actually go out into the fields and pick these crops. And it was really hard work.
What kind of stuff were you picking?
Beans and tomatoes and things.
Ben?
And we were such tenderfeet. I mean, we were totally ill-equipped to do this kind of work. We just got these terrible blisters, and we had a lot of fun at night, but we were out in that blazing hot sun. We had straw hats, but we got dirty, and we were paid by the bushel basket, and we'd look around, and there were some older women there who were evidently used to farming. And they'd pick so fast, and they'd run up with their baskets, and we were going pick, pick, pick. So we were just not really worth our weight. So they called us in, and they said, "You, I guess, aren't quite up to this job, so we're going to put you in the map room." And so they taught us some skills having to do with the collecting of crops or keeping of records or something. But we were failures, is what it amounted to. As farmerettes, we just were not physically up to that work. It was really hard. And I can remember sitting in these bean fields. You could see them as far as you could go. I thought, I will never feel the same about vegetables. What's involved in getting those into that basket. So very worthwhile experience for me. So that's what I did that summer, and then I went back to college, and then the following summer, I got this job at the defense plant.
Gotcha. Can you guys keep Ben out? Yeah. Thanks. And just let's keep the door shut because we're having lots of noise. Thanks. So how old were you when you worked in the plant?
It was 1945, so I was 18. And that again gave me a tremendous respect for people who work in those plants. That was hard work. And I remember one of my friends wasn't allowed to do it. They said, "Oh, you'll collapse." But we took a lot of pride in it. Not only was I pleased to get paid so well, gave me a different they called her Rosie the Riveter. And they had a lot of respect for these older women who came in and worked in these plants, because up until then, they only would hire men. So it was a breakthrough for me. I thought, well, if I can do that, I felt I could do a lot of other things. So I considered myself one of the people who, in a sort of an embarrassing way, benefited from World War II. As far as me personally was concerned, I never had to go to battle. But meantime, I had met my husband in high school, and I was very conscious of the fact that he was out risking his life, and so were my brothers. That was really hard. We weren't allowed to know where they were, and so there was just this constant feel of, will they come back? Will they be killed? And there were a number of Bernathen boys who were killed. So it was a very anxiety-ridden time. So that's what this big celebration was about. And so I look back and think we didn't really see the implications of the atomic bomb, but I can sympathize with these people who were very glad to have the war over. So it was very mixed feelings. We wanted that war over.
What did you do with the money that you earned?
I went through college. Some of it I took and went to New York for the summer, to Columbia. That was fun. But one of the most amazing experiences that I had was that same summer, I would come home from work at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I would sleep all day, get up at about 3, eat, and then go back to work. And one night I came home, and the living room was full of swastika, flags, and pictures of the Holocaust, and souvenirs from Europe. And I realized that my father had come home. He was a war correspondent at the end of World War II. His job was to go, he wrote a book about this. He was supposed to go over with a group of representatives from the United States to evaluate the effect of air machinery on war. And they gave these people very wide berth. He was allowed to go into Hitler's Eagle's Nest, and they went into Berlin and saw it in absolute rubble. And he worked with, I think there were 23 representatives that went.
This was after the war was over, or while it was still going?
It was when the war in Europe was over, but not the war in Japan. And so the government was very worried what would happen after the war was over. Would we get the truth? So they sent this group of people over there to find out everything they could before people started to misrepresent what had actually happened. And he was picked because he used to write for a magazine having to do with air travel. He was always interested in air travel, and he was also a well-known writer. But it changed his life. He just looked at life differently after he came back.
How so?
Well, it affected his health. He was a European, remember? And to see the damage that this war had done to beautiful cities, cathedrals were destroyed. it was just a devastating experience. It was so hard that they gave them a week rest in Capri before they would let them come home. And there were very rugged conditions. They didn't have decent airplanes because everything was being used to help with the war effort. And so they had to travel in old planes with no amenities, and they just land anywhere and sleep anywhere, and who knows what they were eating. And he was the oldest of this group, so physically it was very, very hard on him. And he became, up until then, he had been a rather, like my brother Donald, lighthearted and saw a joke and everything, but he became kind of grim after that. But anyhow, the shock of me coming home, totally unexpected, and see the living room with all this paraphernalia from the Holocaust, pictures of bodies from the concentration camps. We hadn't been told any of that. And so everybody else was asleep. And they were used to me coming in late, so nobody thought too much about it. So I looked at all this stuff. I figured out that my father must have come home and brought these with him. And so I went up to bed and I kept thinking about this and thinking about this. When I came down the next morning, I had a million questions. Everything was gone. They never showed it to the rest of the family. I was the only one that saw it, and they had forgotten that I would be coming in late at night. So I kept saying, they were so traumatized by this, because you have to realize that they didn't really publicize what was going on in these concentration camps. So later, one of the good outcomes of this was that my father wanted to do something positive, so he got this idea of putting on the Shakespeare play of Merchant of Venice, which is about the Jewish question. And he used all of us for the actors in it. And that was a wonderful healing experience where we went all over the Delaware Valley putting on this Shakespeare play.
How old were you? What year?
By then I was engaged to my husband. He was in it. And we learned the parts, and my mother made the costumes, and my brother made a beautiful backdrop, and we got a truck, and we would travel around the valley, and usually any money that we made would go to a cause like something, the refugees from Europe or something. That was the purpose. It wasn't to make money. My father just felt that he wanted to do something positive. And he was there. That's when his authoritarianism came in. We were very busy people. We were all going to school, and we had jobs and everything. He said, "We're going to do this." And his word was the law. So we said, "Okay, we'll do it if you say so." You really think it's important? Yes, it's important. So at the time, we didn't realize how unusual that was, but he would sit around at night making the props for the play. I don't know if you're familiar with the play, but it talks about the justice, and he would figure out with odds and ends how he could make scales that would be used in the play, and how to make a big book that was the law book, and he was so wrapped up in that. So I think that was his therapy. And he would have gone on doing it indefinitely if we hadn't finally all said, "We have to live our own lives, Pop." You know? Another thing that he did, which showed how much he sort of ran the roost, was every Saturday he would go to auction sales. And that was his hobby. He absolutely loved to go to these places nearby. It was not too far away. And the farmers would bring in all their stuff, and every Saturday he'd bring home all this stuff. We never knew what he would buy. He became well known. Oh, DR, he'll buy almost anything.
Like what?
Oh, if he would see 100 books, without even looking at the books, he would buy them. Or an old rocking chair, or a beautiful mural, or I mean, we never knew what he'd bring home on Saturday. Sometimes my mother would just say, "Oh, what am I going to do with this?" And then he'd phone us all up and say, "I've been to the auction sale. I want you to come over and buy this, dishes." And if he thought it was a bargain, and most of them were really good bargains. He was very shrewd the way he did it. But we felt we had to go over there. By then I was married, on Saturday afternoon, and see what he had bought and buy some of it from him.
Can you just tell us a little bit more too about his career? You mentioned that he was a writer and that he was a war correspondent. How did he start off as a writer, and how did his career develop, and what were his successes?
Well, he was always good at writing, even when he was in school here. He came to this country to attend the school. And one of the first things he did was gather together a group of people and put on a takeoff on Macbeth, for example. He would write these satires, and he would use the names of Shakespeare, but they would be characters in the community and activities that they did in the community. So he was sort of making sport of the characters in the community, but using Shakespeare as the basis. And so he was always counted on to provide the entertainment. He was very funny, and very funny looking, kind of. He was just a character. And people to this day still talk about how he would come up with these wild poems, and so people encouraged him to put them down. So he started a little newspaper, which he called Stuff and Nonsense. And it had these really hilarious poems. I reread some of them this summer about just ordinary things. And he would take well-known poems, like there was a poem about trees, Ode to Trees, and he would change it just a little. I think that I shall never see a plant as messy as a tree. And this, the real poem, of course, was praising the beauty of the tree, but he was talking about what a mess trees make, and you're always raking up the leaves and everything. So this was popular stuff during the Depression. He could write serious, but he had a mentor named Jay Cook, and Jay Cook said, well, since it's the Depression, stick with humor, because that's all, people always will appreciate humor. So he developed that. And that was a big asset for our family, because he encouraged us to see the humor in life and see not to take life too hard, just, turn it into a poem. Or he's a very creative person. And
how did he get into newspaper writing?
Well, he was very aggressive, a marketer, and he would make these little magazines, and he mailed them to Saturday Evening Post, and maybe you'd be interested in this little magazine. He was not bashful about that, about marketing, and so people paid attention, because in those days there was no television, so people really read magazines. And gradually they would ask him to write an article for their magazine.
What were some of the magazines that he would write?
Saturday Evening Post, and he was pretty much in demand. He always got work that way, and he was good. He worked very hard at his trade.
Did he have any steady columns that he would do?
Yeah, he changed the name Stuff and Nonsense from a magazine to a column. And the big newspaper in Philadelphia at that time was called the Philadelphia Ledger, and they hired him to write for them. And so he, from day one, had his own column. And it was mostly about our family and things to make people smile and things to make people appreciate the beauty of life, gardens. He often wrote about his trip on the train from Bernathen into Philadelphia, and what time of year it was, and it was wholesome family stuff. And people liked it. That's what they needed it during the Depression, that life is worth living. And he didn't get into politics, and he didn't get into the big bad things. He just tried to make people see that they were worthwhile, and he was very interested in other people's lives. And I always felt good about the fact that he could make friends with anybody. Somebody'd come and fix something at our house, he'd be friends with them very quickly. He'd want to know all about them. He's sort of resisting the class system in England. He loved that about America, that we considered people equal. And he would fight the class system. But then the Philadelphia Ledger went out of business later, and the Evening Bulletin was the paper that took over, and they hired him. And so he always had a job, and was also given editorial responsibility. And meantime, he was writing these books. And we were invited to go in and see his office sometimes, and go and see how they put out a newspaper. And going into Philadelphia was a big thing. He loved Philadelphia. I don't know whether it was because it was the cradle of liberty or what, but he often wrote about Philadelphia, and he made a big effort to get to know the people that ran the city. And so he made a lot of friends there. And so they would invite our whole family into their restaurant or something like that. So we'd get this nice banquet, and then my father would get up and say a few words, and they'd say, "Oh, Don Rose." Then he got into publicity. He was invited to go down to Atlantic City and judge the beauty contest, and it was all the beginning of what is today the promotion of things. But he liked that. He enjoyed that.
Did you read his article, or his column, and if so, were there any that you can particularly remember that you thought were interesting?
Well, we always read his column every night. That was a big event. I see what he wrote about today. Never tell us ahead of time. We just have fits when it was about us.
Do you remember about you? Or?
Yeah, he would write about me. I remember one he wrote about trying to teach me how to spell. And he pictured me as this silly little girl who would never learn to spell. And so I made up my mind I would learn to spell. I would show my father.
You're a great speller now.
Well, most of the family were natural spellers, but I wasn't. But I thought, I will learn this. I will please. We all wanted to please him. And we loved it when he wrote a column about the cat, for example. We'd laugh and read it out loud, and then he'd bring home his letters he got a lot of letters from his readers, and he'd bring those home and read them to us. And, "Mr. Rose, is it true that you have this cat?" And "I have a cat." So it was very lighthearted and fun stuff. And I think this is how he healed from the trauma of the wars. He was always looking for significance in little things. I remember a conversation I had with my father when I was a little bit older, maybe 16. And I was asking him about our family. I always was trying to get his attention, but he was kind of distracted. You know, he was always sort of staring into space, thinking. So I'd try to get his attention. So I'd try to think up these interesting questions to ask him. So I said something about our family. And I forget what my exact question was, but he sort of turned to me and he said, "Well, you know that our family is crazy." I said, "Our family is crazy?" And he said, "Yeah, haven't you noticed? Don't you see that our family's different?" I said, well, I sort of noticed, but I was hoping it wasn't true. And he said, it's true. Our family is kind of different. And that's just the reality, so you'll have to learn to live with it. So I had these mixed feelings about our family was kind of envied for some reasons because we were on the radio sometime and we got attention. But then other times we were sort of out of sync. We were not the typical suburban family, and we weren't necessarily encouraged to be the typical suburban family. We were encouraged to try out things that made us look peculiar. And they were nonconformists. And so there was a part of me that just wanted to be a typical little suburban girl wearing just the typical clothes and saying the typical things. There was another part that felt very good about the fact that I had a family that would try different things. So I never quite resolved that. But I was gratified that my husband loved it. He integrated with our family very quickly, and he could see the specialness of my parents, who were such good people. They had real values and wouldn't hurt anybody on purpose, and worked hard and tried to raise the kids as best they could and be respectful of the country. And they had their faults, as people do, but we always felt their intentions were good.